My mic as I was walking up here. Good to be with you today. I've enjoyed worshiping with your congregation on a number of occasions, and it's always a blessing. We like it around this area, and we like you. You're a wonderful group that's active in your community, and I appreciate that a great deal. And I pray that the community appreciates it and pays attention to us over here and listens to people who have a message of hope to bring to this community. Marvin was not a good neighbor. He lived in student housing at one of our universities a number of years ago. I didn't know him, but I knew somebody who lived in the same building that Marvin lived in. And there was always trouble surrounding him. It had to do with parking spaces, which were one to an apartment, and if somebody parked where Marvin thought was his assigned space, there were issues with him and whoever showed up there. There was verbal abuse. There was loud music when Marvin wanted to relax and pounding on the walls when he wanted to study and somebody else wanted to listen to music. And there were laundry room atrocities and various things like that. You get the idea. Just bristly all the time against everybody. And everything he did and said to everyone else bore the same message: leave me alone. So people left him alone. In fact, they avoided him. Nobody wanted to have any contact with him. They were fed up with him and his antics, and so they would pass by in the hallway and shuffle through their mail so they didn't have to make eye contact, that sort of thing. Well, one day, Marvin's car wouldn't start. It was in the morning, and people are heading off to classes, and he's standing in front of his car with the hood up, obviously some kind of trouble. And as everybody's going past Marvin, not doing anything about the problems that he was in, a lot of them, I'm sure, were thinking the same thing. Serves him right. You know, he gives trouble to everybody else. It's about time a little trouble came back on his own head. And nobody took it upon themselves to see how things were with him. I mean, they had their own lives. They were busy. They got a class that they got to get to, just like he does. And why should his trouble become their trouble, especially when he never lifted a finger to help anybody else? So when somebody is getting what they deserve, sometimes the folks around them feel a little bit of, well, there's a good German word for it called Schadenfreude. Ever heard of it? It literally means joy, not joy, but trouble joy. You know, you're in trouble, I get joy out of that. Oh, you laugh, but have you ever felt it? With neighbors like Marvin, it's kind of easy to sometimes, right? And so they went off heading to their own lives, their own appointments, their own business, thinking, serves you right, Marvin. You got trouble. You never cared about anybody else's trouble, so your trouble is not my trouble. Well, you know, according to the book of Proverbs, book of wise sayings, in order to have friends, what does a man need to do? Yeah, show himself friendly. Be friendly yourself. If you're not friendly, you're not likely to have friends. Now, you can be friendly and it gets thrown back in your face like Marvin would do to other people. But that shouldn't teach you not to be friendly to people. It should say, well, he's not going to be a friend, but somebody's going to. Now, if Marvin had shown himself friendly, maybe he'd have had some friends in the building and maybe somebody would have stopped and done something about it. But instead, I imagine that a few of these people walking by might have even thought about that proverb and said, well, you didn't show yourself friendly, so I'm justified in how I feel about you in your situation. You reap what you sow, Marvin. Call the tow truck. Marvin reminds me of the nation of Judah in the days of Obadiah. Don't turn to Obadiah, turn to Leviticus. We'll get to Obadiah in a little bit. When was the last time you heard a sermon on Obadiah? Exactly. Some years ago, I kind of set a goal for myself. I said, the whole Bible is worthwhile. I'd like to preach at least once from every book. And so that's how I decided to focus on Obadiah one day. And no, I have not yet got to Song of Solomon. I'm just not sure how that one's going to preach quite yet. But Obadiah's got some interesting things in there. Judah had a mission. It started off when they were unified with their neighbors to the north into one nation, children of Abraham, the promised people, the Israelites. And their mission was to be a light to the world. The means through which other people out there would get to understand the God, not just of the Israelites, the God of everybody. And when they would look and see how they were blessed, that they weren't, getting into trouble with their neighbors, and they were having good crops and good weather, and their children grew up strong and healthy and everything, and they would say to them, why are you so blessed? Why are things going so well for you? They would point them to their God and say, he can be your God too. We talked in Sabbath school this morning about mission. That was their mission. How well did that work out? Let's go to Leviticus chapter 26, and I'm going to look at verses 3 through 6 first, in which God is saying what's going to happen to you if you and I will get along. You stay away from the idols, and you focus on me. Here's what's going to happen. Leviticus chapter 26, they haven't even entered the promised land yet, verses 3 through 6. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commandments, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees their fruit. Your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting. And you will eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I will remove wild beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. Sounds good, right? And what's the condition? Walk with me. Recognize me as your God. Be my people. Obey my commandments. And all this is yours. And what if they didn't? Well, that gets covered here too. Let's skip down here, verses 14 to 17. He talks about that a little bit. But if you will not listen to me and carry out my commandments, and if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out all my commands and so violate my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will bring on you sudden terror, wasting diseases and fever that will destroy your sight and sap your strength. You will plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you so that you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one is pursuing you. Pretty simple. Walk with me and be my people, and your life will go better. But if you work against me, then I can't let my face shine upon you, and you're going to have the same troubles that everybody else has. Because if you notice, these weren't special things selected as punishment for Israel. It was simply that this is what goes on in all the other nations. You want to be like all the other nations? You'll reap what you sow, and you'll live like the rest of them. Because I can't bless you if you abhor me, turn your back on my laws, go your own way. Now, why would God tell his children, this is how I'm going to bless you, and these are the curses that can come upon you otherwise? Well, two good reasons. One is real simple. Teach his children to walk in his ways. Well, the Jewish nation was his children. He wanted them to be good citizens. They were saved by the blood of a coming Messiah. And they had a future that would go on throughout eternity. And he wanted them to be prepared to live in the kingdom of heaven by walking according to his statutes while they're still here on earth when the times are tough. So reason number one is teach his children to obey. And reason number two was to teach his children to obey. But different children this time. Because you know who else was God's children besides the Israelites? Philistines were his children. Egyptians were his children. Persians, Thracians, Greeks. They were all his children. And he wanted them to learn to obey him because of what they saw going on among those who did obey him. And he said, I'm going to start with this group. And let's let this spread everywhere. And I go back to the question I asked a few minutes ago. How well did it work? Not so good. Why? Because they weren't good neighbors. They wanted to hoard those blessings to themselves and look at everybody else who's not a part of us as inferior and treat them that way. And by the time Obadiah came along, things were really going sideways for them. The Babylonians were on the horizon. The kingdom had been split in two centuries earlier, and the northern kingdom no longer existed. And there wasn't much left of Judah. And so along came Nebuchadnezzar with his armies for the final time to put an end to everything and carry them off into captivity, which, by the way, it was going to happen no matter what, right? Because God had said, even a generation earlier, I'm going to bring the Babylonians here, and they're going to carry you into captivity, and the land is going to get rest from all the idolatry that you've put upon it. And I'm going to get idolatry out of your system. And you'll come back home again someday. But you'll come back home different than the way you went away. Now, it did work. Jews never again had a problem with idolatry. Had other issues. The whole Pharisee population sprang up because of their need to stay away from idolatry, but they took things too far another direction. Well, let's get back to Obadiah. And in fact, maybe you could turn there for a minute. Because as we're looking at Egypt, or I'm sorry, not Egypt, but Babylon showing up to carry everybody off, it was spreading, this whole Babylonian world domination thing. And it was going to get to some other nations, but it hadn't quite yet got south of Israel to a nation called Edom. Now, the Jews were the descendants of Jacob. You know who Edom was descended from? Esau, Jacob's twin. These were relatives, cousins, idolatrous cousins, but they were cousins. And when they were coming into the promised land, God said, leave the Edomites alone. They are your brothers. Don't fight with them. Be an example to them and treat them like brothers. But of course, as I said, they weren't always good neighbors. They were pretty much like Marvin was in his apartment building. Their actions said to everybody else, leave us alone. And while Abraham lived, he was a good neighbor. You know, when his neighbors got in trouble and got carried off by marauding bands, he went out and rescued them. When there was a dispute over a well, he said, take the well, and he moved away. When it was time to say, you know, your people and my people are too much for this land, you choose which way you want to go, and I'll go the other direction. His children had a tough time following that example, though. And I don't just mean his Jewish children. All of his children have had a tough time following that example. And the Israelites, in their day, and Judah in its day, still had those issues about being a good neighbor. Do we ever hear of Israel rescuing their neighbors? No. They never attacked the Edomites because God said, don't do it. But they never helped them out either. We're good neighbors. And they were disobedient to God in other ways too. And finally, they were getting their comeuppance. And it was a punishment that God was bringing on them, sending the Babylonians in to do it, and nobody could have stopped it from happening. And you know what the Edomites did when it was going on? They laughed and made fun and joined in. Because some of those some of the Judahites broke free and were escaping, and the Edomites rounded them up, brought them to the Babylonians and said, here, you missed a few. And when the Babylonians had left, they moved in and said, what did they leave behind that we could sack too? They took joy, they took schadenfreude in what was going on with the neighbors that had just been doing stuff to drive them crazy for generations. And they said to themselves, they had it coming. And now that they're getting what they deserve, we're going to enjoy it. Pass the popcorn. Good times. Obadiah, just one chapter. Let's see what God had to say to them. And this was specifically to Edom through the prophet Obadiah, who apparently was of that tiny little remnant that wasn't worth hauling off into captivity. Excuse me. Beginning in verse 11. On the day you stood aloof, when strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their distress, nor gloat over them in their calamity, in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. Now, that was all of the things that Edom had done to Judah, even though Judah had it coming, and God said, I'm going to bring this punishment on them. So what if Edom had thrown in a hand and said, let's help out our brothers? Would it have stopped the Babylonians from doing what they did anyway? No. So you might say, well, if they had done all of these things differently, that would have been futile. And you'd have been right. But God says, sometimes it's time for a futile gesture. Just because they're getting what they deserve doesn't mean you're the one I'm calling upon to make things worse. You're their brothers. And you don't kick them when they're down. Edom, of all things, should have come to Israel's aid, even though it would have been futile. You ever tempted to kick someone when they're down? You ever give in to that temptation? And say you're justified because of how they've acted? After all, serves them right. Where were they when you needed a friend? How did they treat you when you were making mistakes? And if you're too much of a Christian to make trouble for them when somebody else who has it coming actually gets their comeuppance, do you at least take silent pleasure in what's going on? God says that's not the right thing to do. He says don't look down on your brother in the day of misfortune, and who is my brother? Well, we know Jesus addressed that, didn't he? Anybody who needs help is your brother. Don't look down on your brother in the day of his misfortune. Don't rejoice in his destruction. Don't boast about his trouble. And by all means, don't add to it by joining in with the tormentors and making trouble worse. And we might say, I'd never go that far. If Marvin was my neighbor and he had a dead battery, I wouldn't be happy about what happened to him, and I wouldn't add any misery to it by mocking him as I walked past. But would you stop to help him? Or would you just let him reap the results of being a bad neighbor and walk on by? I lived in Berman Hall the last year that it stood at Andrews University. I was an RA in the dorm, which meant I had to take the evening check to see if everybody was in and make sure that things went well, settle disputes, keep it quiet so people could sleep or study or whatever. And one of the guys who just was going crossways all the time was Thomas, not his real name. But Thomas thought he was a little better than everybody else. And Thomas thought the rules don't apply to Thomas. He's special. And part of what helped him to feel special was the year it came out, he got a red Mazda RX-7. Oh, beautiful little car. I was driving a Ford pickup, rusted out, missing tailgate, that actually won the ugliest vehicle on campus award. Oh, don't feel bad for me. I entered it. It was a fundraising thing. But I won it. And most of the guys that lived in the dorm with me didn't have anything a whole lot better than that. Well, Thomas did. And Thomas decided I ought to be able to park it where it's safe. So there was one specific spot that he used to love to park, but you weren't supposed to park there. There was a sign, no parking. Yellow paint with the stripes across it to say, this is not a parking spot. Now, it looked like a good parking spot, but you couldn't park there. And he would park there over and over, and he would get tickets, and he would tear them up with great fanfare, and was always at war with campus security over that, among other things. Well, it turns out there's a reason why you shouldn't park there, because this is Southwest Michigan, which experiences what is called lake effect snow, which if you haven't been through that, you haven't been through snow. And when you shovel the snow off of a parking lot, you have to have somewhere to put it. Guess where? And so one day when they had their piles of snow and there's this nice little sports car where they're supposed to put it, they radioed down to headquarters and said, there's a car parked where we're supposed to put the snow. Red RX-7? Yeah. Put the snow where it belongs. So I'm walking back to the dorm after class, and I see the door bang open and Thomas shoot out and head down over the hill towards plant services. So I wonder what that's all about. And then I turn and see this pile of snow with a bumper sticking out of it. Now I know what it's all about. Went back to my room. About an hour later, I'm coming back out to head to another class, and I see Thomas coming back up over the hill. Turns out they had mercy on him down at plant services. They loaned him a snow shovel. You know how I felt? I had been clashing with this dorm resident all year long about making too much noise, about not showing up for room check, about being a bad neighbor in the dorm. And it just in one ear and out the other, making no difference at all. And I thought maybe now he's going to learn a thing or two. You know what I should have done? Grabbed a shovel. Because I think he might have listened to me a whole lot more while I was helping him dig his car out than when I'm standing in his room with a clipboard explaining the rules again. Because even though he'd been a bad neighbor, when he was down, kicking him didn't help. And my form of kicking didn't involve mocking him openly, but I was sure snickering on my way away, much like the Edomites. It was a lot more fun to watch him shovel his car out. Sure didn't help his attitude any. Good news is I met his brother-in-law years later. He's a different man today. I suppose that incident may have helped him along the way, but I'm sure not going to take any credit for how things turned out for him. Because we need to learn the lesson that Obadiah brought from the Lord to the Edomites, who, though they didn't recognize him as the only God, they were still his children. And he said, your brothers over there, don't kick them when they're down. One more text I'd like you to look up here. Luke, chapter 23. Excuse me. Speaking of people who get what they deserve, here's a story of a couple of characters who, what they deserved was to die. And Rome said, we've had enough of you two, and we're going to put you to death. And they ended up on two sides of someone who had the same punishment as they, but it did not serve him right. Jesus had done nothing to earn his place on the cross, but there he was anyway, carrying the sins of both of those men and everyone else who ever lived. And as the story unfolds in Luke 23, I'd like you to read it with me. I know you're familiar with it, but let's go there again. Starts in verse 39 on through verse 43. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly. We got it coming. For we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. The salvation of that criminal is possible only because Jesus did not say, serves you right. Oh, sure, now, when you're hanging on a cross, you turn to me and say, help me, please. No. Anyone who turned to him, he said, I don't turn you away. You will be with me in paradise. But did you ever notice how Jesus treated the other one? He would have given him salvation too if he had asked. But he not only didn't mock him, didn't add to his troubles, he did not even have schadenfreude in his heart and saying, well, I can have love for this guy, but hang on the cross, you fool, die, and that be the end of it. No. What we know of Jesus tells us his heart went out to both of them. And how sad he was that only one of the others received it. When Marvin stood in front of his car with a dead battery and all the people streamed by with schadenfreude in their hearts, thinking that it served him right, the fellow that told me the story went over to his car and got out his jumper cables and chose to be a little bit late to class himself to help somebody who didn't deserve it. I don't know what it did for Marvin. Maybe it helped him to think about things. Maybe he turned his life around. Maybe not. That's not the point. The point is the man with the jumper cables who understood you don't kick your brother when he's down. And he may not act like a brother, although I had two brothers, and I tell you, brothers can act pretty interesting sometimes. But you treat them well anyway. and you decide that no matter how bad things get for you, you can count on me. And if you don't want my help, that's okay too. But I'm here for you. And if we become that kind of a church, they'll know it out there. Don't kick your brother when you're down, even when it serves him right.